this is a rather somber topic. We're talking about grieving and the end of life. So I'll begin by talking about something fun. It's okay. We'll get to the bad part. So I like to ski. Skiing is one of my favorite things, and a few days ago I was at Jay Peak Ski Resort, which is a famous ski resort, probably the best ski resort in the East, and they were getting a lot of snow, and they hadn't opened up part of the mountain, so I was the only one over there. And I hiked up, and I skied down, and it was just magnificent. It was wonderful. It was the first really epic, incredible skis of the year. And it was so good that I needed more. I needed another round. So I hiked back up again, about 2,000 feet up, and for a second lap, as they say. So it was nighttime. The lifts were closed, and no one else was up there at all. And it was snowing, and it was untracked, and it was about 5 o'clock. So this time, it was this light out, and I didn't have a headlamp. And I went down one of the hardest trails, the Double Black Diamond, alone. So the first thing to say is it was great. It was fantastic. It was epic. Skiers say epic all the time. We say that word because it actually is epic. It's incredible. It's everything the Trojan War ever was. So, fit into just an hour. It was incredible. Hike up, ski down. I took some hard falls. I almost died a couple of times. One of the times I think I may have died. I don't know, maybe this is what it's like. Nice to see you. Thanks for being here. In heaven or hell or earth or wherever we are. So I finally got down the mountain, and I considered a few things. One was that a friend of mine told me that I should keep a note in my pocket because I love Jay Peak. I really love that ski resort. So the note should say, it's not their fault. Right? Because if I die, at some point I'll probably die up there, and then I'll freeze to death, and they'll find my body, and somebody might try to sue Jay, and I don't want them to do that. So at least now I'm on record. It's my fault. I shouldn't be up there alone in the dark when it's snowing in the part of the resort that they haven't opened yet. Okay, great.
Without a headlamp.
Without a headlamp, that was an issue. Yeah, the lack of the headlamp was actually the biggest problem. Thanks for saying that. It's true. If you're skiing after sundown, you should have a headlamp. I had one in the car. So why am I bringing this up at the beginning of this talk? It's simple. It's that there's an event that happens, and in our lives, that we are advised to make that event happen as soon as possible. Which is to say, we hope that this will happen when we're as young as possible. That's what we hope. When we're as young as possible, we want this to happen. I guess I should say it doesn't necessarily happen for everyone, but it happens for most everyone. And if it can happen when you're a child, that's great. If it happens when you're a teenager, that's almost as good. If it happens when you're an adult, that's okay. If it happens when you're quite old, well then there you are. And the event is that you realize that you're going to die. Few of us have realized this, let's face it. Not very many of us know this. If we were asked, someone could say, are you going to die? We would say yes, but that doesn't mean that we know that the answer is yes. We just said the word out loud. We didn't even hear it ourselves, usually. We just say it loud. Yes, we say. But actually, it's rare that we have actually seen this, that we're going to die, that we are actually going to die. Now that may be when you're skiing at night at J. And it may be when you're lying in bed one pleasant evening. It may be while you're driving, it may be while you're in the hospital, it may be because you're killed. There are lots of different possibilities, but in any case, it's going to happen. We are going to die. The question for us is how? That we have a little bit of control over. How will we die? And of course, when we say how, we don't necessarily have a lot of control over the how in terms of is it cancer or a car accident. That we may not have a lot of control over, but we still have control over how we die. We still have control over the experience we have as we die. That we can train for, that we can get ready for. And the way we get ready for it is simply by knowing, being very clear, knowing that we are going to die. We face that. We absolutely face that fact. I am going to die. It turns out that this is difficult to face. It turns out that this is hard for us to face. It's hard for us to actually realize that we're going to die. A long time ago, as many of you have probably heard, there was a prince, a relatively young prince in North India, named Siddhartha. Any of you know who I'm referring to? How many of you know who I'm referring to? Oh, that's pretty good. Well-educated crew. So, for those of you who don't know, this person eventually became the historical Buddha, Gautama Buddha, or Shakyamuni Buddha. He realized when he was relatively young, in his late 20s, that he was going to die. It's said in the legends, had never heard that he was going to die until he was in his late 20s. It said that his father wanted to protect him from knowing that he was going to die because he had the sense that if his son knew that he would die, then he might not want to be a king. He might want to actually face the problem of death and resolve it. And a king, that isn't what a king is paid to do, you could say, right? A king is paid to, well, basically kill, right? Does that make sense? I mean, the government is something that has, one of the essential characteristics of a state is that it has a monopoly on murder. It is allowed to kill, but no one else is. This is well known. So that was his job. His job was to hold a monopoly on killing, not so much to deal with the problem and the significance of death, because if you were to do that, then you'd be worried about your own death, and you'd also be worried about the deaths of the people who you were killing, and you wouldn't be a very effective king. So his father wanted to prevent him from knowing that he was going to die, and it took him all the way until his late 20s to realize that, in fact, he would. It's actually very interesting to me. You know, I've seen scholars who, I guess I'm a scholar in a way. It would be hard to say I'm not, although I would say I'm not. It's hard, but I pull it off, I hope. So I as a practicing Buddhist rather than a Buddhist scholar, tend to look down a bit on scholars. It's a long-standing tradition. We've been looking down on scholars for millennia. so I laugh a little bit when scholars have their scholarly debates about, well, was it really possible, especially at that time in history, to prevent a young man all the way through his childhood, his teens, into his 20s, from ever hearing about death? Could that really have been done, they ask themselves, and then they do some kind of research. Which I find funny because when I look around, nowadays, I see a lot of people who made it through their childhood, their teens, into their adulthood, without ever hearing about death. Not even once, ever. It's incredible, isn't it? It's amazing. How did we do it? Well, our father, you could say, our culture, the state, a number of different agents, don't want us to know about it. They don't want us to know about it. And there are lots of clever ways that they figure out to not tell us about it. One of them, for example, is to include a lot of death and murder in unrealistic ways in media. This is actually a great way to prevent people from knowing that there's such a thing as dying. One of the things that people are most surprised about when they are shot, if they survive, is how much it hurts. It's shocking how much it hurts to be shot. Because when you see it on TV and such, you don't feel the pain, first of all. You don't. And a lot of the time the actors don't portray it. Also, I don't know how many of you have actually had a gun pointed at you, but I have. And you don't act the way they act on TV. On TV, they're relaxed and they come up with a clever line. In reality, it's nothing like that. I don't have any way to explain it. I'm not going to try right now. But it's not like what you're led to believe it's like on TV. It turns out that when you're actually face-to-face with a gun, when you're face-to-face with death, it's not the way you expected. And so I find it interesting that we debate whether it's possible for a person to get into their 20s without knowing that there's death. Most people get into their 20s without knowing that there's such a thing as death, without knowing that they're going to die. Most people get into their 60s without knowing that they're going to die. Most of us go through most of our lives without ever noticing that we're going to die. The way the Buddha talked about it, and he had the right to because he realized it when he was relatively young, the way the Buddha talked about it, being raised as a king, he made a lot of metaphors based on the military apparatus of the day. And so one of the components of the military establishment at the time was were horses, thoroughbred horses. And he said that there are different sorts of horses. There are 4 different types of horses. There's the type of horse which, if you just raise the, what do you call it? The width, the
Riding crop?
crop,
Mm-hmm.
crop. Are you an authority on the topic?
Short width
Crop.
is called the crop.
Excellent. So, so you just raise the crop, the thing that you hit the horse with. You just raise it, and the horse goes. The horse does its task. Other horses, you have to then hit it lightly. You hit it a little bit, and it goes right away. Others, you have to really beat it. You have to hit it to the bone, as they say, and then finally it goes. And other horses, just you can't get them to do what you want, even if you beat them. And there are these 4 types of horses. And then he said, this is a metaphor. And this metaphor has meaning, it's not without meaning. And the meaning is this. There are 4 types of people in the world. There are those who just hear of death and are terrified. These are the most excellent sort of people. There are those who need to see a loved one die, see someone who they know die, in order to become terrified of death. These are pretty good people. Then there are those who actually themselves have to have an experience. They have to get sick or they have to be injured. And then they become terrified of death. And these people are, okay. But then most people, sadly, no matter what, they don't realize the significance of death. It never occurs to them. They don't realize what a travesty, what a catastrophe it is to move through a whole life without ever facing the significance of death, without grieving, without experiencing a sense of urgency around the feelings, the emotions connected with death. This is problematic partially because we're missing out on our own lives, because if we're avoiding facing death, then it's not possible for us to live a full life, not possible for us to make full use of each day, so we're missing out on our lives if we don't have this experience. But beyond that, we also don't understand the significance of all lives, of life on the planet. As I often say, we live in a culture now where when someone we love dies, we may still go to work that day. This is a sick culture. If we value each other so little, we don't even grieve each other's deaths to the point that we wouldn't go to work because we had a significant project due. Their whole life is worth less than that responsibility. And we live in this place where we know that we're surrounded by people who know us and say that they love us, but they also will go to work if we die. They don't really care if we die. They're not going to actually grieve, the same way that we won't really grieve their death, because we haven't faced the significance of death. We haven't faced the significance, therefore, of life. Because of that, we haven't truly valued our and others' lives. We're not giving a true valuation. We're just turned into resources. We see ourselves and each other as instrumental. We're helpful to make the economy run, and we're helpful because when I'm around you I feel better. Things like that. And being instrumental, we lose track of the precious nature of each life, and we stop cherishing ourselves and each other. And because of that also, we lose out on the significance of life. It's essential for us to be willing to grieve, willing to deeply grieve, or else we're not in a position to truly love. And beyond that, we have to understand that when we love, that means we're going to grieve. That's part of the equation. You're going to grieve, and that's part of love. That's part of it. One of my favorite stories is I have a friend who teaches quite a bit in the public schools. And it's her job to go in and teach various ordinary subjects with art and dance. And she entered a biology class at one point and was told, okay, we're going to use this new learning modality in order to teach the life cycle. And she said, very good. Well, you tell me what I should teach, and I'll help the children to learn it through this artistic medium. So how do you teach the life cycle? Tell me. And I said, okay, this is the life cycle. There's birth, yes, and then there's growing up, and then there's having kids, reproducing. So teach that to them. She said, oh, right, well, that's great, I'll do that, but maybe, and she was sort of nice about it, but maybe you just forgot one of the parts. I know you're the teacher and all, but maybe you forgot the fourth part of the life cycle. And they said, I don't think so. Those are the three parts of the life cycle. And she said, well, what about death? She said, oh, well, that isn't part of the life cycle. That's death. That's different from life. That's not part of life. And besides, we don't want to frighten the children. We don't want them to feel bad. We don't want them to think about that they might die someday. Now you recall the first part of this talk, yes? It's true, we really live in a society that's intentionally trying to prevent us from knowing that we're going to die. They don't want us to freak out and be worried and make lifestyle adjustments accordingly in order to appropriately value the significance of our lives. Because you probably aren't going to die anyway. I mean, who knows, right? It's an unknown, it's the future. Can't predict the future. Well, you can predict the future in this way. You're going to die. Everyone you love is going to die. Everything you love is going to be lost when you die. And that's worth grieving. It's not worth avoiding. It's worth looking at closely. And again, if you can grieve in that way, if you're capable of grieving in that way, then it becomes, our hearts open. Our hearts are torn open so that we can see the significance of all of our lives, and in fact all of the lives of all of the living things on this planet. And when we see it in that way, then finally we're directly dismantling this current worldview, the current way of looking at things, which is basically that we're resources. We're economic resources. That we're emotional resources. We help different things to happen. And because we get stuff to happen, we're valuable. We see others as valuable when they can get the things to happen that we want to have happen. We consider ourselves to be good, to become better people when we can get more to happen of the right sort. We can finally start to dismantle that way of seeing, that view, that perspective. We can cut that apart and see that there's something more valuable than any of that is alive in us. And that is love. That exists. There's such a thing. We know it exists. We already know it exists. We know it's real. We know it's there. But we cover it over with so much confusion that we lose track of it. So how do we find it again? We find it again by dealing with, facing, sitting with, feeling in our bones the significance of death and the precious nature of life. As I say, one way to judge how we're doing in life is simply how quickly, how soon do we know that we're going to die? How quickly does that happen? It's a good question for each of us to ask. How long is it going to be until I realize that? It's worth looking at. I wonder how long it will be. I hope it's soon. I hope I can do that soon. Might be a while, but I hope it's not a while. I hope it's soon, actually. But I don't know how long it'll be. But at least this part's up to me. At least I can do this. I wonder how long it'll be. Maybe it'll be today. Maybe not. But maybe to start to look at it in this way is a fundamental shift in how we see what life is all about. I think for most of us, we think things like, how old will I be when I have $1 million or something like that? How old will I be when I have a kid or something like that? But these are important parts of the life cycle. They're just not the whole life cycle. And the death part of the life cycle is something for us to face also. How old will I be when I realize, when I actually see that I'm going to die? When I actually see that. Now, if we see that, our lives change. And so it's easy to know whether you've seen that. Has your life changed accordingly? Was there a day when you saw, I'm going to die, and then your entire lifestyle changed after that? That's how you know. It's a very easy way to measure. If you haven't seen it, then your lifestyle hasn't totally changed yet. If you see it, everything shifts. Absolutely everything shifts. Because one of the things we face is the utter vulnerability of that moment. The utter vulnerability of that moment. The incredible vulnerability of passing away. That moment is certainly coming. And at that moment, we won't be able to protect ourselves at all. Not in the slightest. We won't even be able to move our arms or legs. We won't even be able to move our senses. And we won't be able to move our minds. We won't be able to use this structure in order to prevent ourselves from knowing what we already know. Namely, how we have lived, the choices that we've made, who we have been. There are a lot of different kinds of vulnerability at the time of death. There's the vulnerability of not being able to avoid pain. Sometimes there's a lot of pain at the time of death, and there's nothing we can do about it. We can't give it to anyone. Sometimes there's the realization that things we wanted to say, we wanted to tell someone, we'll never ever be able to say or tell them. It will never happen. Problems that we had in relationships will never ever be resolved. This is a kind of vulnerability as well. But one more type of vulnerability that comes is the vulnerability of no longer having this anchor to grasp onto, to be anchored in, to be tethered to, so that our various states of mind don't carry us away. Some of us here, I suppose, have experienced panic attacks, have experienced anxiety attacks, have experienced depression, have experienced various other subjective, you might say, mental, you might say, maladies, illnesses, problems, disorders. I myself I've struggled with some of this, and one of the things that's been helpful to me that someone else who's also struggled in a similar way to me told me was, she said, it's okay, you'll always come back. I don't know why, but you always do come back. You return to functional eventually. I don't know why, but you do. And it's true. As long as we have this body, this basis of a subjective experience, we are at least drawn back. There's a pull back, you could say. So those of us who have these issues, we know, okay, we at least know, even if we don't believe it, we have the sense that I'll be able to come back, I hope. When you're in this situation, it's really helpful to have the sense of, soon enough I'll get out of it. Soon enough might be a long time, but eventually it might be possible to get out of it. It's helpful to have that attitude. But at the time of death, there's no guarantee of that. Because if you have the tendency to go in that direction, then this anchor back to this human realm, back to this ordinary human experience, this anchor falls apart. You're untethered from it. And you can go any number of places then. Many of them are quite wonderful. And most of the reports that we get from people who have near-death experiences or actually die and then are brought back, most of them report very pleasant experiences. Unfortunately, and that's good news, because there are very wonderful places to go, very, very wonderful places to go. The bad news is that one of the reasons that the majority of the reports are positive is that it's a lot easier to come back from those places. If you go to heaven, it's much more likely that they'll let you come back than if you go to hell. If you go to hell, they're not that interested in hearing your side of the story. And it's much harder to get back to this body, and once you're there, it's very hard to get out at all. So, I know that this is a little bit of a difficult topic, but I already gave my apologetics for why I would talk about it last week, so it's now on YouTube, I think, so, right? So you can watch it if you want and see why I think it's okay for me to talk about this, despite the fact that I live in a fundamentalist, materialist society. So those of you who are fundamentalist materialists, well, come along for a little bit of a ride. I was sent a really wonderful letter after last week's talk about the amount of suffering that there can be in the world. And I was someone who works a great deal with a community in which there is great joy and great success and also a great deal of suffering. There's suicide, there are overdoses, and there's even violence that, who knows, at some point could easily become homicide. So this is the sort of society that this community that this person works in on a daily basis, and works in it, I should say, with great love. And very impressive, very inspiring to watch such service given to the world. So she was talking about the pain of the people in this community, how a lot of people just can't take it, and so they leave the community one way or another. There are different ways of leaving a community, of course. Many different ways, and people leave that community in those various ways, and how hard that is and how important it is for us to be strong, loving, accepting, but also hold boundaries because things are so difficult, and people don't have boundaries, then sometimes you do very, very bad things. And in the course of this description, in the letter there was much more detail, which I can't provide in a talk like this, but it was quite powerful to read. I'd have to just ask you, since I can't report the details, to imagine some of the sorts of communities that this might be describing and some of the things that might be happening in those communities, and to remember that those things are happening right now, at this moment. There are horrifying things happening right now in the world at this moment, and in fact, while we might generally think of those terrible things as happening elsewhere, some faraway place, I'd suggest to you that it's possible, and in fact likely, that some terrible things are happening right in this neighborhood right now. And we shouldn't pretend that that isn't true. We should be able to face that. Just within a few hundred yards of this building, probably in some house, something terrible is happening. Truly, truly terrible. This is the world that we live in, and the letter, the email, made it very clear that such suffering exists in the world, and we have to deal with it, we have to face it, and face it with love. And so at one point in the message, in the letter, she said, don't tell me that these people aren't experiencing hell. Don't tell me that these people aren't experiencing hell. You'd have to work very hard to convince me that they're not experiencing hell. And again, there may be some people right here in this room who at some point have had such hellish experiences. Well, I'll say that differently. I know with certainty that there are a number of people in this room who have had such hellish experiences in their own lives, not just witnessed others, but in their own lives, have had absolutely horrific experiences. Unfair, unjust, and damaging. Unacceptable. So here we are in a world with these sorts of experiences, and I wouldn't say at all that this isn't hell. I wouldn't put it that way. But I do want to make a distinction. I want to make this distinction so that later on I did my part. And I know that you live in a society that has a very powerful PR campaign telling you, on the one hand, that you are your physical body. That's the materialist agenda. That's what you are. You are your physical body. That's all you are. You are a bunch of physical materials stuck together in a certain way. That's what you are, and that's all you are. And I know that you've been taught that, and so what I'm about to say might seem hard to believe. And I also know that you've also been trained that you are your emotions. It's another teaching that we have in our society, that your emotions are what you really are. They're the highest authority in your life, and they're your true identity, and who you feel you are is who you really are, and all that. And I know that a lot of us have been trained to believe that we are our thoughts, that your thoughts are what you are and all you are, and that's your value. You can think clever things, and therefore you have value. If you didn't think those clever things, you wouldn't have that value. And people who don't think clever things don't have much value, and so we don't take very good care of them. But good news, you can think clever things, and so we take better care of you because you have value, because you are your thoughts. These various teachings have been provided to you, and in all likelihood, since you were young when you started getting them, you probably ate them up like candy. So, okay, we're going to try to speak through all that right now and make a very different suggestion. First of all, you are not your thoughts. Second of all, you are not your feelings. And third, you are not your body. What we are is the fruit of our actions. And when we consider, therefore, hell, it's important to distinguish it from hellish experiences that we have as human beings. In the same way that right now those of us who have been through hellish experiences can remember them, but right now, here in this room, we are not experiencing them. Okay, the sorts of hellish experiences I'm talking about right now, I can tell by looking, are not happening in this room. They're not. So just understand, I'm talking about objective states of hellish experiences. I know with certainty they're not happening in this room because I can see what's happening in this room, and that's not what's happening in this room right now. I've seen terrible things happen. Those things aren't happening here now. Now, I'm not going to get more clear because I don't want to traumatize anyone, but I think all of you can follow what I mean, right? Not too much yet? Okay, good. In the same way that you can have had those experiences and remember them and be traumatized by them and even relive them, it's different from being in the situation. There just is a difference. That's all. It's not that one is more suffering than the other. It's just that there is a significant difference. In the same way, to be a human who experiences hellish experiences but will probably return to basically an ordinary human mind soon enough, is significantly, and I would even go so far as to say objectively different from being in a hell realm. In a hell realm, that's the anchor you return to. But there's another difference, which is that the amount of pain that is experienced in most hell realms is more pain than a human being can experience without dying. Let me say that differently. If a human being were to experience that amount of, the only way to inflict that much pain on a human being is to put them in a situation that would kill them. It would kill them relatively quickly. But under those circumstances, because you're made of different stuff, you actually don't die. And it's terrible, and it lasts a very long time. I bring this up because while it's also true that there are wonderful realms, truly extraordinary realms, which in the same way that you can say, this is like heaven, you have a heavenly experience right here as a human being. There are heavenly realms in which that's what you return to, and you stay there for a very long time. That's true. But there's no guarantee that you're going to such a realm. It's possible that things could get really bad after you die. Really, really bad. And this also is a reason to be concerned, to grieve, you could say, to be concerned about death, to be deeply concerned. If, in the first case, as I said, you realize, wow, I'm going to die, that means that my life is precious. That means that everyone's life is precious. then naturally your whole lifestyle changes in order to take care of all living things. Automatically, a deep compassion for all beings emerges. That's the measurement. That's how you know that such a realization has happened. It's objective. Other people can watch and see. You can't just do the thing that we say in our culture, well, I feel that I'm such and such. No. People can tell. Other people's judgment is valid here. In the same way that when you realize that's the significance of your life, you realize the significance of everyone's life, and then automatically a deep compassion comes, moving outward. In the same way, in the other direction, you realize that our actions determine what happens to us in the future. And we realize that if we participate in a system that causes killing, if we are complicit or even active in the process of the destruction of life, then that will have real consequences for us later that can be terrifying, absolutely horrifying, unimaginably horrifying. And because of that, we change in that different direction. We change our lifestyle to be sure we don't continue to participate in a system that destroys life. For example, the system that's destroying all life, the current economy. Our current economic structure, to the extent that we participate in it, we're participating in the destruction of life at a scale that has never been seen in our history. If we're participating in that, if we're not fighting against that, if we're complicit or even active in that, then we're storing up the conditions for a horrifying future. So either way that we understand this, whichever way we understand it, you don't all have to understand it in any particular way, but whichever way we understand it, there is immediately a lifestyle change. That lifestyle change is objective. It's an objective lifestyle change. It can be seen. It can be measured. It can be, most importantly, celebrated. Because to live from this place of compassion is a cause of celebration. It's the experience of rejoicing. To become free of this burden of the karma of being involved in such destruction of life is cause for celebration. It's rejoicing. There's a rejoicing that comes from that could not come from the gaining of any material object. It couldn't come from the gaining of any big subjective experience of a good movie or meal or partner or going on a trip or something like that. None of that, all of those external sources don't compare to the joy of an internal shift in how we develop our lives. That rejoicing is then the basis, must be the basis of a community like this. That celebration, that constant celebration, that day after day, somebody at least in this community, somebody here is making this breakthrough and realizing a completely new kind of joy that allows them to rise up above the current system and transform it, knowing with certainty that they're living according to a love, a blameless love for all living things. A community like this, a culture like this should be based on that, and when we have a culture that's based on that, a community living by that culture can produce an economy, a different economic system, a different societal basis that will be able to, at least to some extent, transform the larger whole. As far as I'm concerned, that's what we're doing here. To bring forth that true rejoicing, that true celebration, that magnificent exaltation of heart. That's what we're here for. And where does all that begin? We have to start somewhere. Where? What is the thing that brings us to this joyous, magnificent dance? It is grief. It's grieving. It's because human beings are unwilling to grieve death that we've become the melancholy, destructive species that we see on this planet today. It's time now. It's our opportunity. We've come here this evening. to take a step in the direction of joy. So, let's take a step into grief. Take a moment to settle into an awareness of your body. And in particular, bring your attention to your breath. Pay attention to this one precious breath. It's precious, it's what's keeping us alive right now. And it's okay to enjoy it, to appreciate it, to feel gratitude for the air that we are breathing right now. Our ability to take another breath. Consider the in-breath And consider the out breath. And very gently, very, very gently, no need to force this, very gently continue to exhale on the out breath until the fragility of your life becomes apparent. That means until you realize, if I don't inhale soon, I'm going to die. And with that, reinforce your knowledge of how precious this breath is. Of course, you're allowed to inhale again. It's gentle, it's a gentle process, but we're aware that if we didn't, if we weren't to inhale soon, we would die. And that way, we can experience the precious nature of each breath. For people who have had panic attacks, a sense of being unable to breathe sufficiently may be familiar. For other people, other circumstances may have arisen that made that clear. At this time, we're gently, in a controlled manner, approaching that awareness, that clarity of how delicate our lives really are. We need to breathe all the time. Just a little while without breath, and that's the end of life. We're approaching that awareness gently, carefully, in a controlled manner, but firmly, clearly, diligently, in order to allow the proximity of death and the precious nature of life to enter our bones. And yet, you can consider that for now, you are able to take another breath. At this time, you are able to take another breath. Feel gratitude for that. And let that gratitude also enter your bones. And yet, consider that there will come a time when you cannot inhale again. There will come a time when you've taken your last breath. To stay with this is the purpose of this part of the exercise. To just stay with that knowledge. It's not a complicated exercise. Stay with it. Explore it. Most of us have already come up with an idea, a conclusion about what kind of subjective experience we're supposed to have when we consider our death. Maybe we're supposed to be afraid. Maybe we're supposed to be at peace. Maybe we believe, oh, it's okay, I've lived a good life, I'll be at peace when I die, it's going to be fine. Or, oh no, it's going to be terrible, it's going to be awful, I will have wasted my life. I'm asking you now to just stay with it, either more deeply experiencing that, or noticing that perhaps that's not what you're experiencing. Perhaps that isn't what's coming up for you right now. Maybe it's what you planned on. But I've been with people when they die. I have never seen it go according to plan. I've seen people plan it out carefully, and then it not go that way. So stay with this just in case it turns out that what you thought you would experience when you did such an exercise falls away and something else happens instead. The way to do it isn't by thinking up a new experience. The way to do it is by simply staying with the knowledge that someday soon you're going to stop breathing. You just stay with it. That's all. Know that more and more deeply, rather than knowing more and more about it. Just know that deeply. with this awareness, with this cultivated clarity, be aware that everyone you love, everyone in the world also will come to a point when they take their final breath and they do not inhale again. And just stay with that. Stay with that. That's all. Simply stay with that awareness. You may have the sense, well, it's no problem, not a big deal, we all pass away, nothing to be worried about. Okay, well, stay with it until that passes away. Until that idea about death dies. You may think, oh no, at that time I won't have told them this thing that I always hoped I would. Very good, experience that also. But then stay with it until that passes away. Whether it's one or the other or something else, simply stay with it and see if there are any other sensations, any other qualities of this experience that emerge. It's not that you're searching for something else. It's just that you're staying with this and allowing it to unfold. finish, I have a question that you might explore. Explore for yourself, to understand from your own experience with your own insight. Take the clarity, the awareness that you've cultivated, and explore compassion with it. How does the exploration that we have made this evening result in compassion? In particular, I'd ask, why is it that the fact that we must die mean that we mustn't kill? Why does the truth that we must die mean that we must not kill? Why? Again, explore this not with mere philosophy. Don't just think about it logically, but use the awareness. Use the clarity that you've cultivated this evening to look at this question from the perspective of that clarity. Examine this question. Again, there's no need to come up with a complicated explanation for this. On the contrary, look for the most obvious answer that comes directly from the awareness that you've cultivated, and then simply experience that fully. Experience that down into your bones. It may change then, it may evolve, it may shift, that's fine. Let it. But not based on mere mental consideration. Experience it fully. If it changes of itself, let it. And then experience that fully. Why is it that the fact that we must die means that we must not kill? time for conversation, discussion, questions, comments, anything at all. The time is yours. We have about 25 minutes for this, and I'm curious about what many people have to say, so I might this evening actually be a little bit quick with the replies, because sometimes we spend most of the time on just one point. But, yes?
You assert, which I believe modern day America minimizes death, sweeps it under the rug, rationalizes it. I agree with that, certainly, for any number of nefarious or foolish reasons. But anybody, or I'm going to suggest anybody over age 30, and certainly by the time you get to my advanced years, has experienced or has had any number of close friends and family die, often in person, their children. I mean, I've been to enough open caskets and enough funerals and memorial services when it happens suddenly in a car crash, when it happens over years of debilitation. How can we reconcile, or how do we work with, we have a culture that minimizes death, but death is still there every bit as much as it's always been, and we are in, even the most indoctrinated person has to look at that open casket and realize they will never see their mother again.
Well, first of all, I really appreciate that you say that death is just as present as it's always been. Not everyone knows that. I've heard people say, intelligent, well-educated, considerate people, yes, say the following words. Of course, nowadays, it's not like ancient times when more people died. I've heard people say that, it's amazing. More people died back then. And nowadays, it's much harder to be aware of death because not as many people die. Isn't that extraordinary?
The population's 100 times more. There's 100 times more deaths.
You'd think that they would see that. But they don't. Their subjective experience of death is, as you say, minimized. And if we continually practice that avoidance of facing it, of, say, grieving, then even when it happens, yes? Even when it happens, the practice, the habitual avoidance of facing death still has its influence, even under those circumstances. One of the things that I find, especially as I explore these topics with people in depth, we weren't able to do it in depth this evening. Some of you may be extraordinarily skilled at this or practice, and so you may have gone deep, but for most of us, this is a real process and can take a long time.
Grieving, you're saying?
Yeah, facing death and learning how to be willing to grieve. I don't know that you have to learn to grieve, but you have to learn to be willing to grieve, and then you go through a grieving process that unfolds. You could say you learn it, but I think it's more you allow it. But one of the things you do have to learn is how to be willing to go through that process, and that can take time. A lot of the time when I work with people more deeply, we start seeing that we have this underlying belief that most of the time I can brush it under the rug, but then when it really happens, when I'm dying or when someone I love is dying, at that moment somehow all of that habituation will just fall away, and I'll be truly present and aware and all of that. But in the moment, that actually isn't what happens. You continue to avoid it, even in the moment, to some extent. Now you can compare the amount that you're avoiding it most of the time to the amount you're avoiding it in that moment, and it's less. But if you were facing it this much most of the time, you'd be even deeper into it at that moment. You'd be even more present. And so I think it can be helpful to see it on this spectrum, that whatever our actions are, whatever the habits are that we formed in our minds, those don't just vanish in a moment. On the contrary, they continue to have impacts, even though we can cut them off to a large extent. If they were already cut off to a large extent, then we would be even more present and clear and fully realizing the significance of what's happening.
So your takeaway is that we don't, at least in American culture, grieve effectively or appropriately as we used to or should in order to understand our own pending death.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And I think it's actually, we can say American culture, but I actually think it's considerably more widespread than that.
How far do you have to go in today's society before you get to a better understanding or a better acceptance of grieving and death?
Well, in my opinion, that's what monasteries are for. So you have to enter a monastery and take the training seriously. But that's one of the main gifts that a monastery offers us and offers society. It offers a place for us to face this, and therefore a place for us to go if we want to be shown how to face this. So it's a refuge of sanity.
From Western culture.
Yeah, although I don't know if it's only Western culture that has this issue. You know how they have insane asylums? Monasteries are kind of sane asylums, right? And I think that many different cultures need sane asylums, not just the Western cultures. We just have our own particular issues that I tend to talk about more because I'm more familiar with them. Yes. In the front.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
So, I piggyback onto what you were saying, so I feel like the grief, I'm in the grieving stage,
Mm-hmm.
and it is so heart-wrenching,
Yes.
and I can spend hours,
Mm-hmm.
and it just doesn't feel like, there's a point where it feels like, people say, well, what did you do today? Well, I just spent 4 hours, in deep grief, and it's
Yeah.
my grief, but I get to this place where I feel like it's bottomless.
Right.
It's bottomless. And it hurts and
Yes.
keel over.
Yes.
And a part of me then goes, am I just wallowing? Is there a
Mhm.
point where it just becomes wallowing?
Yeah.
And that's juxtaposed with the fact that I don't want to fucking let go,
Yeah.
Just don't want to let go.
Yeah.
And so is the monastery the only place? You just said that the monastery is a sane asylum.
Mm-hmm.
What about us who are sort of monks out in the real world because we have to do the work that we're doing?
Yeah.
How do we find a way to create the space for this and to have some sense of support?
Yeah. It's a great question. And actually I think you're asking a few different questions in the one question. I'll try to answer most of it as much as I can briefly. I think the word you brought up is very useful. You used the word wallowing. Now we don't want to wallow in grief. We don't want to wallow in suffering. That's true. And that is possible to do. So it's good that you bring it up. We don't want to think just because I'm suffering, I'm moving through suffering. It's not true. You can think I'm suffering so much that I must be moving forward. It's not true, sadly. Oftentimes, in order to move through suffering, the suffering has to get deeper and deeper. But just because you're more and more stuck in it doesn't mean you're getting out of it. Doesn't mean you're going through an appropriate process. So I really appreciate that you put it that way. And I'll come back to that if I don't, then remind me to this first point. How can you not do that? How can you know that you're not doing that? But actually before that, the easier place to go in answering the many different points actually that you made. Sometimes a person is, I think you spoke very eloquently, sometimes eloquence makes it look like many different things are just one thing, because they're put together so skillfully. But you actually said many things in what you just said, and so I have to piece them apart and then attempt to answer each one. So another word you used, which some of you probably knew I might bring up, is you used the word real. Remember that? Remember how you used it? Anyone remember?
Real world.
The real world. The real world. The real world. So the thing that people call the real world is not a real world. And yet we call it that, and that matters. It says something very important that we call it that. Why do we call it that? Well, something can seem real for a lot of different reasons. Yes? One of them is simply that we are stuck in it, or you could say, if you wanted, wallowing in it. Right?
Yes.
We wallow in non-grieving. Right? You can say, I don't want to wallow in this suffering, but we can also wallow in avoiding suffering. Now, if you wallow in avoiding suffering, you won't ever see the significance of joy. You won't see the simple fact that joy resolves suffering. It's such a simple fact, but we don't see it. On the contrary, we start to believe, no, I think suffering resolves suffering. I'm pretty sure that if I can just suffer more, then I'll get through suffering. I think it's the suffering that's the path through suffering. I'm pretty sure that that's true. And then gradually that starts to look real. And we think, well, I'm going to wallow in it. Right?
But there's a difference between suffering and grief, isn't there?
Well, yes, there is. And I'd say grieving is a certain kind of suffering.
Okay.
But I'm expanding it out a little bit beyond the specific question that you asked in hopes that it may serve more people. So, so as we face suffering, as we truly face it, we naturally see that the creation of suffering is not the resolution of suffering. And when you put it in words like that, it seems so obvious, but most of us sincerely don't know that. We think that the creation of suffering is the resolution of suffering. And our actions demonstrate that belief. But that's not true. The resolution of suffering is the resolution of suffering. And what is the resolution of suffering? It's joy. It's freedom. So we realize the importance of, we have to see the importance of moving through, wallowing in this thing that we call the real world, which is the avoidance of suffering, which is also not the resolution of suffering. The avoidance of suffering is the creation of suffering. To avoid suffering is to create suffering. That's how you create suffering, by avoiding it. Facing suffering, then, is the beginning, anyway, of resolving it. But the goal is to resolve it. That's what we're trying to do here. Trying to move through the grief. It's true, actually through the grief. Which brings us to another point. Yes? So it's true, you don't want to wallow in this pain. You also don't want to wallow in this meaningless numbness, you could say, or the real world, as people call it. Yes? Or we get to the point where it's as if nothing really matters. We don't want to wallow in either one. And so when we look at it that way, we finally come to the final point of the many things you said that I'll face right now, which is, what about this bottomlessness? What about how it is that it appears that there is no end? We can just keep going forever, and there couldn't be an end to it. How do we face that? How do we deal with that? And in particular, so that's already a hard question to answer. You already asked an excellent question, but then you made it harder to answer. Not it's not your fault. You asked the question very skillfully, but the question is actually harder for me to answer. The challenge level, you increased the challenge level for me, because then you said that you have to answer the question in a way that's relevant to life in this world, because that's your responsibility, as you said. You have to work, as you said. So for some reason, any number of reasons, you have the responsibility to work in the world, and so we need an answer that will relate to that. Correct? So now this is hard to answer. Does that make sense?
Well, yes.
It's an excellent question, and one that is challenging for us to really look at and deal with. Nonetheless, I'll do my best. So, the experience of compassion is a skillful merging, a skillful interweaving of, well, a number of things, but now I'll say two different things. Primarily two different things. The first is an awareness of the suffering of the world, a concern for the pain of the world, an unwillingness to accept the way things are. Okay?
Yes.
If you look at the Buddha, for example, when he was Siddhartha Gautama, the prince, he did not make use of the method that we now learn is mindfulness. He did not consider, yes, I'll die, everyone I love will die, and it's okay. Because things are fine as they are. He did not think that. Not at all. He didn't think accept things as they are at all. He completely did not accept that. He said, no, absolutely not. I do not accept this. I will escape. I don't accept suffering. No. I need to find the escape from suffering. I don't accept grief. I don't accept this bottomless pit of grief. No. I will escape from it. Okay? This unacceptance, this concern regarding suffering, a sense that this is not okay, we have to do something about it, is motivated by a hope, a commitment, a dedication to not just resolve suffering, but provide a liberation that is the highest bliss, the highest happiness, to actually realize the resolution of suffering in a way that's vibrant and alive and joyous. So compassion consists of, yes, an awareness of suffering, but not only an awareness of suffering, it's skillfully woven into a dedication to bring forth joy. Yes? If you only have an awareness of the suffering, that isn't yet compassion. It's not bad, because you need it, and it might be important to experience that for a while, but it isn't enough. You also need an active dedication to do something to resolve that, to bring forth true happiness. Yes?
Yes.
If you have that dedication, and you're skillfully bringing it together with this bottomless pit, okay, then you learn how that love, which is an action, not just a feeling, but is something that you're doing, not just that you're going to do, but that you're doing every day. You learn how the bottomless pit pulls you down, and yet it also simultaneously deepens the love. Yes? And as long as that's happening, and you're finding ways of expressing that in your life, because it's something that you're doing, not just something that you're feeling, but something that you're doing, then you are successfully not wallowing in the pain, even as you live a life in this world. How did I do?
Wonderful, thank you.
I've got enough?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. It was a very skillful question, and I can tell that one of the reasons for that is that you've spent so much time struggling with this, and that's a great gift to all of us, and you then took action as a result of that, and so you've already demonstrated the answer that I attempted to describe. Somebody in the back had their hand up.
I did, and
Yes.
I was going to ask about the relationship between grieving and acceptance. I think you've already answered.
Okay, if you feel that way, then that's fine.
You did, or I answered in my own head.
What's the answer?
I think kind of what you were just talking about is accepting the fact that there is death. I mean, not just accepting the fact that you're grieving.
I'm sorry, say that last part I didn't hear.
Accepting that there is death,
Yeah.
not just that you are grieving. That you kind of, maybe that acceptance is a step
How so?
beyond grieving
How so?
because it can bring you joy.
So to accept death is to experience joy? Fascinating. Tell us more. Yeah.
I don't know. My grandparents were Ukrainian immigrants,
Yeah.
and I think there's maybe something in my DNA that's
Yeah.
got that Slavic melancholy. And also, my parents were older than, they were in their late 30s when I was born.
Uh-huh.
So, death, my childhood, I was not protected from death.
Yeah, right.
By any means. My
Right.
maternal grandparents were dead by the time I was 3.
Yeah.
My paternal grandparents were dead before I was out of high school. I had lots of aunts and uncles dying. Now I'm old enough to have colleagues, contemporaries dying. But as a kid, we went to funerals, we went to cemeteries.
And how is it that
And
acceptance?
I remember one of my early memories was standing, my uncle was being buried, my aunt was picking the pile of dirt by the dug grave. She was picking stones out of the dirt because when she died, she didn't want all those rocks falling on her. So that's a different way of looking at death.
Yes, definitely.
So I knew it was, it just never occurred to me that wasn't part of life.
Yeah.
I guess.
And how is it that acceptance of that is joy?
Because it happens to, it's as much as part of life as birth.
Uh-huh.
I don't see a whole lot of difference.
And so if birth is joy, then death is joy? Is that the point you're making? And so each experience we have can be joyful, and therefore death also can be joyful. Is that I'm just trying to understand.
Yes, yeah. And sometimes it isn't joyful because it hurts, but
Yeah.
eventually it's like being depressed. If you're depressed, it goes away eventually.
Uh-huh. So then the joy is in the disappearance of the pain, even if it's present temporarily?
Accepting the fact that it's there and that it's going to change.
Uh-huh. Great. So in a certain way, you can learn to experience change, birth, death, each day of life. You can experience each of those things as change, and that change can be learned. We can learn how to experience that as joyful. Is that what I'm hearing?
Mm-hmm.
And then last question, how? How do we learn to experience that change as joyful?
By going through it.
Very good answer.
Thank you, Soryu.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for answering all of my questions.